Hey everybody, my name is Lindsay Nielsen and I'm the marketing coordinator at EcoEngineers. We've received so many requests to bring back this topic after our first decarbonization webinar. So welcome to case studies in greenwashing. That's what everybody's been colloquially calling it. So we decided to just continue the theme. I want to go over a few housekeeping issues before we start. We will have a Q&A session in the last 20 to 25 minutes. So feel free to type your questions into the question chat function during the presentation, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. As usual, the webinar is recorded and it'll be shared automatically in an email once the event is over. We'll also post a blog with the video in the weeks following the event. You will receive a link for a feedback survey in that same email after the webinar. So please fill it out and let us know what you thought. And if you have any other suggestions for future webinars, let us know that too. So introducing our panelists for today. This is our list of presenters and experts. You'll be hearing from Shashi Menon, our CEO, and Sarah Caswell is our resident policy expert, and Dr. Roxby Hartley is our compliance management team lead and LCFS program expert. And of course, I will be reprising my role as narrator for our case studies. So before we get started, I wanted to play a short video that intros EcoEngineers and how we fit into the clean energy economy.
Carbon is the biggest disruptor of the 21st century, and the world as we know it is changing. EcoEngineers can guide you to make the best decisions as you navigate toward your clean energy goals. Our diverse team of carbon analysts, engineers, scientists, auditors, and regulatory specialists are trusted advisors of the clean energy fuel sectors worldwide. Clean energy regulations are a maze. We simplify them with an unbiased approach and fully manage your compliance. Modeling your carbon reduction is complicated. We quantify your emissions with a rigor based in science. Together, we can create markets that will protect and grow your investment. We create sustainable solutions for a better tomorrow. We are EcoEngineers.
All right, and here's Shashi to talk a little bit more about EcoEngineers.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Shashi Menon, CEO at EcoEngineers. That video is EcoEngineers in a nutshell. So we're a team of scientists, engineers, lawyers, accountants, auditors, and consultants, all with the deep expertise in fuels, technologies, and carbon policies. Through our services, training and education, regulatory engagement, lifecycle analysis, asset optimization, compliance management, and auditing, through these services, we provide a 360 approach to the clean energy transition. And we have found that ultimate success of low carbon fuel projects depend on our areas of expertise. So a little bit about this webinar, why greenwashing? It's really because we're at the heart of an energy transition right now. And from our vantage point, we see all kinds of projects happening at the ground level. We're witnessing net zero goals being made, and we're seeing ambitious policies being drafted. At the core of this transition is a carbon accounting framework. Understanding carbon accounting and how carbon markets function is key to successful transition to a net zero economy. So what is carbon accounting? Carbon accounting is counting emissions, reductions, and sequestrations. It's a set of credits and debits, and placing the right amount of credits in the right column, in the right ledger, in the right book is important to the overall integrity of a net zero claim. And the uniqueness of carbon accounting sometimes makes this challenging. And today, Lindsay is going to lead us through some case studies that illustrate some finer points of carbon accounting and the importance of getting it right. But first, I want to invite Sarah Caswell to give us an overview of US carbon policy as it stands today. Sarah?
Thanks, Shashi. Well, this fall, there's a lot of actions on both the federal and state levels that could significantly impact the low carbon fuels industry. Today's webinar will focus on examples of greenwashing to illustrate the importance that these legislative and regulatory actions are carefully crafted to promote investment, innovation, and development of low carbon fuels so that they may continue to be a key ingredient in efforts to reduce harmful greenhouse gas emissions. However, first, I do want to quickly run through a few of the key legislative and regulatory developments that are happening right now. First, the 2021 and 2022 proposed RFS rules. The official version of the proposed rules are not expected out before October 4th. However, as many of you probably know, late last week, the potential proposed volume levels were leaked. And in summary, for years 2020 through 2022, these leaked volumes would propose to reduce ethanol blending down to actual annual blending levels, taking into account overall reduced gasoline demand and then the proposed volumes would increase blending of advanced biofuels, including biomass-based diesel and cellulosic fuels. We'll have to wait and see if the leaked proposed volumes are the actual proposed volumes, but already stakeholders from all sides are starting to get engaged in this. And I think we can all expect a lot of activity during the rulemaking process. On the infrastructure bill, Congress is still haggling over the cost and the content of President Biden's major infrastructure policy proposal. The House of Representatives is scheduled to debate the proposed $3.5 trillion spending bill this week. Individual House committees have already voted on their pieces of the infrastructure legislation, and some of those pieces that have passed out of committee and could be included in the House version of the infrastructure package include incentives for renewable energy technologies, energy storage, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, energy efficiency, and other technologies that reduce carbon emissions. The package also will likely include a lot of extensions of current renewable fuel tax incentives. Several industry experts believe that a final version of the infrastructure package probably won't be passed until later this fall or winter. It must also be passed through the Senate, where some of you might have read some moderate Democrats have already expressed public concern over the high cost of the bill in their opinion. On CARB, the California Air Resources Board has begun holding a series of informal public workshops on specific topics that will likely be included in the agency's proposed rule expected out next year, which would update the state's low carbon fuel standard regulation. All stakeholders are encouraged to sign up for CARB LCFS email updates through the agency's website and to fully participate during this informal part of the process. It's important. CARB staff are proactively seeking stakeholder feedback to inform the nature of the updates that will be included in the proposed rule, which will start that formal rulemaking process. CARB staff likelihood to include stakeholder proposals, of course, increases with stakeholder participation, and the staff accept written comments for 2 weeks after each workshop. So I really encourage everyone to provide those comments as they see fit. On the state level, several states beyond California are continuing their efforts to craft and pass state low carbon fuels bills and regulations, including, but not limited to, Washington, New Mexico, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska. These efforts are important as they are designed to promote innovation and development of renewable transportation fuels. Also, they will likely impact any effort to craft and pass any national low carbon fuel legislation, just as state laws impacted the RFS, which was passed in 2005 and again in 2007. And finally, with respect to recent elections, as you know, California Governor Gavin Newsom and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have both survived their recent election challenges. The outcomes are especially significant with respect to our industry because they'll allow California and Canada's carbon reduction regulations and legislation to move forward without too much change. It will just ensure the smoothness of that process. As I've already mentioned, the status of the California LCFS regulatory update. In Canada, for instance, the government can continue with the policy to enact the Clean Fuel Program with a likely release of the formal regulation for comment later this year. In addition, at the state level, British Columbia intends to conduct a review of its current LCFS law this fall and winter and propose new legislation to update it as necessary next spring.
This is super exciting to see all this legislative movement. But can you talk a little bit about the timing of the RFS RVOs? Now, what happened? How does it work? Like the OMB and the EPA have to agree on an RVO number, then they have to release a proposed rulemaking, and then there's some 30 or 60 days for comments, and then they finalize. So what are we looking at? Like, when will we have the final numbers?
It's a really good question. And of course, I can't give definitive answers because nobody has seen the actual language of what EPA has sent over to OMB for consideration. So the process is that EPA has sent its proposed rule or rules over to the Office of Management and Budget, which is in the administration. And then that begins a 30-day review process, at least 30 days, at OMB, where they go back and forth with the White House and EPA, and they come up with a final version of the proposed rule sent over by EPA. Usually it doesn't change much, but we're not sure this time. It seems to be taking longer than most of us would like and longer than most of us would expect. OMB periodically posts updates on its website in terms of the timing of the process. And so last week there was an update that agency would not be releasing the EPA proposed rules for RFS until at least October 4th. So what will happen once the proposed rules are finalized in that process, the formal rulemaking does not start until the proposed rules are published formally in the Federal Register. Once that happens, that starts the clock in terms of the comment period. I think a lot of us think it will be a 45-day comment period, not a 60 or a 30, but we'll have to see. Can't make any promises. But as they do every year, during that formal rulemaking process, EPA will have a separate public hearing on the proposed rules where stakeholders will have an opportunity to present oral testimony to EPA officials. Usually the testimony is limited to 2 to 3 minutes, just because usually there are a lot of stakeholders who want to provide oral input during that written comment period as well. So it looks like by statute, EPA is supposed to finalize the following year's RFS rule by November 30th. So that would be for 2022. They haven't obviously even proposed the 2021 rule. So as far as timing, if the proposed rules are released around October 4th, theoretically you could get to November 30th, but I think it would be pretty tight. So I think we're looking to late this fall, early winter maybe. But of course I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. I think that answers your questions in terms of timing and what the process is going to look like.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
All right, we ready to get started here with our case studies? This is actually a good segue because their first case study has to do with the Better Clean Fuels policy and which one is more likely to succeed. So here we go. Congratulations are in order. Sarah has been elected as the 48th president of the United States on an independent ticket. Despite now being a politician, she is still very true to her concerns about the climate and wants to put in place some strong policies to achieve net zero emissions from transportation by 2040. Her popularity is so high, she can do just about anything she wants. So her first order of business is to hire EcoEngineers climate scientist Dr. Roxby as her climate czar, and he gets to work. Roxby is charged with ultimately presenting 3 policy options to achieve Madam President's goal. The first one is to electrify everything in the transportation grid or transportation sector. The second option is to establish and mandate a new low carbon fuels policy. And the third is to put money toward the problem and invest in clean fuel infrastructure. Let's take a look at each of these options individually. So the first one, electrify everything. He proposes that the country cease manufacture and sales of internal combustion vehicles and transition to entirely electric vehicles by 2040. His second proposal is to mandate a national low carbon fuels policy that drives emissions down over the next 20 years. This policy would be fuel neutral, technology neutral, and performance based. And again, it would have a net zero emissions goal by 2040. Now, the third option that Roxby presents to Madam President centers around clean fuel infrastructure investment. Over the course of 20 years, the government will put money into clean fuel public transportation, highways, low carbon fuel production, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And this would all be completed by the 2040 deadline. So Madam President now has 3 options to choose from for her clean energy goals, and it's time for our first poll question. Which of these policies is more likely, do you think, to achieve net zero emissions in the transportation sector by 2040? Remember, it's option 1 is electrify everything. Option number 2 would be a low carbon fuels policy. And option 3 is to invest in that clean fuels infrastructure. I know we've seen all of these options in the news in some way, shape, or form. So here are the results. It looks like an overwhelming majority of our audience thinks that the low carbon fuels policy is the way to go. What do you think, Roxby?
Well, I think the majority of people are right. Option 2 is the most likely to succeed. It has a goal to get to net zero, and neither of the other policies did. In option 1, it would work as long as there's another policy that will make the grid net zero, so that it takes away all the emissions from the grid. And option 3 will reduce emissions from transportation, but there's no goal to get to net zero. And you could argue that you wouldn't need option 3 anyway, and you have to go ahead with improving the infrastructure. So yes, but the audience generally got it right. Option 2 is the way forward.
Roxby, if I just wanted to add, that's exactly right. Option 3 is like a part of the solution, but it doesn't address a comprehensive solution to get to net zero emissions. And you're right, it doesn't have any carbon measurement or reduction goals. And that would be a key part of any legislation that would actually achieve net zero. In addition, I feel like in option 1, if we electrify everything, and even if we get a net zero electric grid, it doesn't recognize the improvement in emissions that's capable within the existing incumbent internal combustion engine vehicles on our roads today. Only a comprehensive policy that would recognize that those vehicles are still going to be on the road today, but trying to target lowering emissions in the liquid fuels going into those vehicles would complement the electrification efforts as well.
I think that's what you get for appointing a Brit as a climate czar.
Right. I think the main takeaway, the main point of this case study is that any net zero goal or any set of policies that are driving towards net zero must be accompanied with a science-based measurement system that measures carbon reductions, measures life cycle analysis of fuels, measures emissions and sequestrations, and it must have a system to measure these things. In the absence of such a system, it's just an empty claim. So in that context, and I kind of want to circle back to you, Sarah, and your commentary earlier on U.S. And Canadian carbon policy. It seems like there's a lot of talk on option 1 and option 3. There's a lot of talk about an infrastructure bill that will invest in like all kinds of clean emissions, clean transportation infrastructure, which is all great. I love the more they do, the better. And there's also a lot of talk about electrifying everything. But what I don't hear is a lot of talk about a low carbon fuels policy. I know Canadian policy is a national low carbon fuels policy, and California has done it, British Columbia has done it, and Oregon and Washington are doing it. But what is the chance that we can potentially achieve a national low carbon fuels policy in the US?
Thanks for the question, Shashi. Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that as well. And as we've talked about within EcoEngineers, we really do need such a policy to achieve the lofty goals the Biden administration, for instance, has put out there to achieve net zero by certain date. In my opinion, the focus on option 1 and option 3 is probably the easier lift in terms of getting passage in Congress or in state legislatures, because option 1 and option 3 address one part of a solution, not a comprehensive solution. So it might be theoretically easier for policymakers and elected officials to gain the necessary public support for one piece of a policy instead of a sort of an omnibus comprehensive policy, if you will, because the more complicated a policy, there's arguably more opportunities to take issue with one part of it or more. I think that in the biofuels industry, at least, and I think in others as well, there's a recognition that after next year, it will be really up to EPA to set the volumes for the different categories of biofuels, including ethanol, right? And so for a lot of folks in the industry, there's talk that that would not provide the kind of policy stability and sort of predictability necessary to drive further investment and innovation in the industry to the extent that it's possible, right? And so there's there's beginning to be a lot of conversations about how could we potentially extend or replace or something a national policy that could drive further innovation in biofuels and other renewable fuels designed to reduce carbon emissions to then achieve the president's goals, right, for net zero. And within those conversations, there's a lot of support I'm finding for a national low carbon fuels policy because the success in California is just so obvious. It's driven innovation and new markets and that kind of predictability that nascent industries like ours really need to get off the ground and achieve the kind of widespread results that public policy right now is looking for in terms of net zero.
Thank you. So talking about biofuels and policy, Lindsay, are we ready for case study 2?
We are definitely ready for case study 2, talking about biofuels and policy and scope 1 emissions. So here we go. Some years later, after Sarah has served her terms as president, Roxby establishes a software company in Silicon Valley. Now, we all know how deeply concerned he is about the environment, and he decides he wants to focus on eliminating his scope 1 emissions. He recognizes that all of his scope 1 emissions are from burning natural gas for space heating, and he wants to eliminate his dependence on natural gas in favor of more renewable resources. So he transitions to landfill methane as a new source of heat. The project is super successful. Roxby declares 0 scope 1 emissions in his annual report, and most of his shareholders are super happy to see it. His stock price goes up, but not all of his shareholders are so convinced. Sarah is one of them, and as we know, she has some background in climate issues. She's concerned that Roxby is just greenwashing the statistics in order to make his annual reports look good. So she hires EcoEngineers to conduct a life cycle analysis of the renewable fuel Roxby says he's now using for his heating needs. They find that landfill methane has an average carbon intensity, or CI, of 45.29 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. And then Sarah comes to the conclusion that based on the positive CI analysis, burning those gases cannot be zero scope 1. And she's pretty upset about it, as you can see. Sarah files a lawsuit that says that Roxby is misstating material information in the company's report. And according to Sarah and the filing, if the fuel has a positive carbon intensity, Roxby cannot claim zero scope 1. So what do you guys think? Here's our next poll. Does burning renewable fuels result in zero scope 1 emissions? It's a yes or no question, but you can say it depends if you're unsure. I do wonder how much heat a software company in California needs in general, but I suppose this is our hypothetical situation.
I'm mining Bitcoin.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. Wouldn't you need cooling then?
Probably.
All right, so I'm gonna close the poll here in a couple seconds. Kind of a lot of people did the it depends, but kind of split. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I'm right. Roxby is right in this. And it depends on the definition. Emissions from scope 1 are burning fossil fuels. And since I'm no longer burning fossil fuels, I don't have any scope 1 emissions. I have to report the RNG use, the emissions from the RNG use, but it doesn't count in my emissions inventory. And CO2 emissions from combustion of RNG, ethanol, etc. are all treated by CA GREET. That's the model that we use for fuels in California, as zero, because the CO2 in the fuel originally came from the atmosphere. It's effectively recycled. And scope 1 is a very broad brush saying, if I'm burning renewable fuels, all the CO2 is recycled, and therefore I have zero scope 1 emissions. I don't contribute to the atmosphere. But the CI score, even though the CO2 isn't counted, the CI score is the aggregate emissions from the production and distribution, which are all upstream activities, and may be reported under scope 3, but not under scope 1.
Just to refresh everyone's, so scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is emissions from combustion and emissions that's within my control.
Right.
And scope 2 is purchased electricity. And scope 3 is everything indirectly related to my operations, such as my vendors and upstream activities. So
Right.
in this context, if I am, I think the key point here is that so burning renewable fuels or biofuels is releasing carbon that was absorbed from the atmosphere, and it's recycling carbon again and again, carbon that's already up in the atmosphere. You're not taking out any fresh million-year-old carbon from fossil sources and releasing it into the atmosphere. And that concept is really key. It's a key concept of carbon accounting and how fuels should be treated under a fuels policy.
I'll just say it's interesting as well. Say I am burning fuels in my fleet of cars. So I own a fleet of cars. I'm burning fuel. That all counts as scope 1. But if I outsource that fleet, if I hire the cars, then it doesn't count towards my scope 1 because it's somebody else's responsibility.
We could probably do a whole other webinar on just the on loopholes that are available to push your scope 1 into someone else's scope 1 and make it into your scope 3. But
Yeah.
I think we'll save that for later. There's a whole bunch of contractual loopholes that can be structured to make that happen. But the key message here is that the biofuels does not, even though they have a positive carbon intensity, they don't necessarily result in a positive scope 1, but they do result in a positive scope 3. And if maybe circling all this back, if it's probably fair to say that if I can achieve zero scope 1, can I claim net zero? That's the follow-up question to this. So if by doing this, can you claim net zero?
No, scope 1 emissions are very, as I say, a very broad brushstroke. It doesn't, there's no real carbon accounting going on. We're not measuring all the emissions that the company is making. And I think it's very dangerous to us to equate scope 1 with net zero.
So what is a net zero claim? I mean, is a net zero claim zero scope 1, zero scope 2, and zero scope 3?
Well, yes, you have to. And if you're at zero scope 3, then you will be at zero scope 1 and zero scope 2 if you get to zero scope 3, because that counts all your emissions from upstream and downstream activities.
I mean, that's a good segue because now we're talking about some scope 3 emissions. Are you ready to move on, guys? All right. Here's our scope 3 case study. And again, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that all of our characters and entities and scenarios appearing in these case studies are examples and purely hypothetical. All right. So while the lawsuit is still pending, Roxby still wants to do something to lower his emissions beyond scope 1, but he wonders what he can do. And he decides to ultimately focus on scope 3 emissions from sources not directly owned by his company. He decides to build 50 electric vehicle charging stations in the office parking lot, hoping to encourage his employees to drive electric vehicles. Even though he's in California, it turns out Roxby has a hard time getting his employees to be excited about driving EVs. But he did remember that the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard actually offered credits for unused charging capacity. So Roxby hires EcoEngineers to help him generate those credits. He knows that they can be an impartial third party, and EcoEngineers helps Roxby secure a pathway to generate credits. He is ultimately awarded 50,000 carbon credits because there is a lot of unused infrastructure on his properties, in his building's property. So Roxby decides he wants to sell those credits. So he sells them for $10 million, which is quite the boon. And it's nearing the end of the year. Roxby's feeling gracious. So he decides to donate his money to his friend Lindsay's charity for homeless beagles. So he's thrilled with these developments. Roxby puts out another report that he generated all these credits, drastically lowering his scope 3 emissions. And then he also mentions the cool $10 million donation to tout his charitable giving on behalf of the company. His shareholders are stoked again, and he sees another stock bump. But here's your next question. Do the carbon credits generated from Roxby's EV infrastructure effectively lower his scope 3 emissions or not? So let's launch poll number 3. Another yes or no. All right. It looks like most people say that no, they don't actually lower his company's scope 3 emissions, 69%. What do you think, Roxby?
Well, our audience is right again. And I just like to say I love beagles. So good job.
You should.
I saw the environmental attributes. Therefore, I can't claim those against any emissions reduction for my company. And when I sell those environmental attributes, a good way of thinking about it is when I sell them, I buy the emissions from other people who bought them, who offset their emissions. And that's basically double counting. I can't claim those emissions and sell them. And as a side point, it's an interesting policy that CARB has where they credit on capacity rather than dispensing of fuels. And that capacity crediting doesn't actually lower the transportation emissions in California. The policy is there to help people build dispensers, to increase the number of dispensers. And in the long term, it will help California, as we pointed out in the first case study. But those aren't real emissions offsets that I'm claiming as well.
So it's really a double whammy here. For one, you never really reduced any emissions, and two, you sold something you didn't do, and you made a bunch of money out of that.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like
I'm obviously not a good person.
Two strikes against you.
I made money from it too, though, so I guess it's not all bad.
Yes, that's right, Shashi. I mean, it's both the point that you can't, if you're going to sell environmental credits, you could claim putting in the charges has helped California meet its goals. but it hasn't helped my company lower its emissions at all. And I think it also illustrates the point that you really shouldn't, when you set up an LCFS, you shouldn't kind of manipulate the credits to compensate for people for doing things that don't actually reduce emissions.
Right. Yeah. It's a you know, as much as all these policies have good intentions, and they will result in some good as well, because you'll have more infrastructure available for EVs. But fundamentally, there's a flaw in it if you're giving credit to somebody for something that they're not doing. And this is kind of an example, the great example of where carbon accounting and actual credits and debits in a ledger is so important to have integrity behind a net zero claim. It's very easy in this current environment for someone to make a claim based on some credits they've generated, and whereas in effect, one, there never were any actual reductions, and then like you pointed out, two, they went ahead and sold it, and then it's no longer theirs. So there's scope 1, 2, and 3 and carbon intensities and policies. I mean, they are enough to drive me crazy. So, you know, what kind of words of advice do you have, and to our listeners, on how to make sense of all this and stay on top of the sort of the energy transition that's happening around us? And just to make matters worse, you know, I mean, we're even seeing it's not just policies, it's not just claims, it's not just unverified claims. It's also the courts. I believe recently a court in Europe, Roxby, you may want to talk about this a little bit more, but a court in Europe told Shell that they are responsible for downstream emissions, which is neither scope 1, 2, nor 3.
Right.
So, yeah, and you know, how does that fit in the framework of carbon accounting?
Well, if you're selling petroleum products, you would think you have to move the point of obligation to the person who's responsible for burning the fuel rather than from extracting it. So if you sell your fuel to say a power plant, say you sell your fuel oil to a power plant, who should be responsible for the emissions? You wouldn't think it would be the person supplying the fuel oil. You would think it would be the person actually combusting the fuel oil. So that was a very interesting judgment, that they were made to be responsible for their downstream emissions for other people using their fuel. I was quite surprised.
So what that is really suggesting is that a unit of fossil fuel, once it's extracted from the ground and refined, it has an inherent tax on it, and that tax can be passed downstream to another body, to another entity, and there's someone along that supply chain is ultimately responsible to pay that tax. And in this case, the judge combined all of that and made the refiner that obligated party to pay the tax. Is
That's
that
correct.
is that like how you're interpreting that? So,
Yes.
but this is sort of like a precursor to really a tax on carbon.
Right. So I think that's a good way to look at it. I think that you're actually taxing the carbon by enforcing the judgment on the company.
So as kind of said a few minutes ago, scope 1, 2, and 3, carbon intensities, court rulings, carbon taxes. It's a sort of a whirlwind of jargon and terms and definitions. And so I know we're running up against the hour, and we want to leave some time for questions. So Roxby and Sarah, what last points do you have to make to help our readers navigate these complexities?
I would say that when you're measuring carbon and you're measuring your emissions, make sure that your claims that you make are within the bounds of the system you use to measure the carbon. So if you're using the California system, make sure that you're using the California regulations. If you're using another system, then make sure your claims are clear about what system you're using.
I do think that it's important for policymakers and elected officials who are crafting these policies and regulations to ensure that scientists are a part of their team, because this really is scientific and it's so important to get it right, to create the best policies that will achieve the net zero goals in the most effective and efficient way without double counting, which we've seen, can happen even unintentionally.
Yeah, absolutely, because policies ultimately create markets, and markets need good accounting. And
Yep.
markets without good accounting is ripe for fraud. And once you have fraud, then the policies take the blame for it.
Right.
And it just creates like a vicious circle, a downward spiral, where
And
people
everyone
blame each other. Saw some of that in the RIN markets, 10 years ago. Right. And we absolutely do not want to repeat anything like that.
No, I mean, all participants in the system need to have faith in the system, right? And so, because, obligated parties, for instance, under the RFS, were, even if they didn't have knowledge of fraud, they were going to be liable for it, right? At some point. And so it's so important that the rules of the policy set up a program where there's the least likelihood of fraud and double counting, et cetera, so that everyone in the market knows the rules, has faith in the rules, and participates in it.
The question was asking, can you comment on a carbon accounting standard and creating one that perhaps is nationally or internationally acceptable, so we can have a shared system for trade?
Right, that's a very interesting question. There is a standard for measuring carbon. The ISO standard exists for how to do carbon accounting. That is available. Making everybody agree to the regulation, a regulation based around those rules would be a lot harder lift. There's no point implementing a regulation unless everybody has to abide by it and it is verifiable. And the auditing is another very heavy lift. I don't know what you think, Sarah, to how something like that would work.
From what I'm perhaps hearing you say is that it's possible to set some sort of an international standard that everybody can agree on, but getting everyone to abide by it would be like almost an impossible task. Did I understand you correctly?
Right. Without penalties for companies that don't comply or for countries that don't comply, it's going to be extremely difficult to drive the world towards net zero goals.
In the case of in the airline industry, we're seeing a little bit of that. It's possible to set national standards or regional, perhaps, but or even bilateral agreements between countries. But it's very difficult to set an international standard and expect every country to abide by it. And if we can extrapolate from that and apply that to all goods and services being traded internationally, then we will run into the same problem. What do you think of the legality of a border tax to address this issue? Is it possible if a country doesn't abide by a certain accounting standard, it's a country, let's say the US or the European Union, could set a border tax to penalize a country that's not abiding by it?
Right, I think that would be possible. I don't know how that works with the WTI?
I was just going to say that the problem with, even if you could do it, the enforcement would be the tricky issue there.
I think it's something that we might have to head towards, because as we want to sequester more and more emissions, as countries say, hey, we're net zero, and if we want to import goods from country X, and country X has these emissions, then you would assume that the import is going to have to pay for the sequestered emissions. So there'll be a tax which is equivalent to how much carbon has to be sequestered on the import of that goods. And that implies that we're measuring the emissions of all the nations, and we understand supply chains extremely well.
Well, thank you.
So did we answer? I know we talked about how complicated it is to determine those carbon accounting standards. Did we talk about how the stakeholders can help the decision makers?
Sarah, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, I touched on it a little bit in our presentation, but for instance, in terms of CARB, for instance, they're working to update the California LCFS, and there is an informal part of that process and then a formal part of the process. And the informal part of the process will be informing what comes out in terms of a proposed rule during the formal part of that process. So I would just say that it's so important for stakeholders to follow the regulatory actions in the places that they plan to be involved in. So California, the US would be the RFS regulatory process. And to take every opportunity possible to provide comments to the regulators, either via oral testimony at a public hearing or written comments in response to a proposed rulemaking. Or in the case of California, written comments following the workshops that CARB staff are having right now, a series of them on specific topic areas that will be included likely in the proposed rule. Staff, the regulatory level, or even on the Hill or in legislative bodies, are only as good as the information that they receive from stakeholders, because they're in a policy role, they're in a regulatory role, and they might understand business, but they don't understand what's happening on the ground in business, in our industry, unless they're hearing from folks in the industry. Those comments and that involvement really makes the difference between an effective policy or or one that falls short of its potential for effectiveness.
Yeah, and I would add that part of our objective at EcoEngineers and this webinar series is to empower stakeholders to be knowledgeable and express how carbon accounting and net zero goals at the supply chain level can ultimately impact net zero goals at the policy level. So I guess what I'm saying is that you must be heard, and you also have to understand the finer details of carbon accounting to be effective in your comments and to help shape policy. One of the things that I'm seeing is that there's more and more movement in the food industry for carbon labeling requirements and carbon accounting. And there's going to be and that requirement that's coming from the large food manufacturers are going to be driving down and hitting the supply chain. And they're going to look to how to transform the supply chains to be net zero. The more the supply chains are empowered in the process of the carbon accounting of net zero, the more they can step up and sort of control this whole process and also have a say in how this process unfolds. And it's important for the agricultural sector, farming sector, and sort of the growers to really be empowered to be part of this, because otherwise, the trickle down idea of net zero is not the right way to do this. It has to be a bottom up approach.
Right, and it needs to be specific in the policies and regulations as to how that's going to happen, to ensure that the economic drivers are there to promote the kind of innovation and carbon reductions that the policymakers are looking for.
Right, I think California has done that. California's made that leap between the regulation and the science, and they've got a policy that can get them to net zero. Whereas I think federally, we haven't quite got there yet.
That's right.
Roxby, you mentioned the ISO as a carbon accounting system. Are there other ones or different systems? What are the kind of other things people can use?
I mean, with California, we use it. It depends on the application, whether using an application to measure fuels such as GREE or GHGenius, that they're using BC, or you're using another methodology which just measures the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions.
Yeah,
So the ISO standard is the gold standard for us, for all of them, effectively.
Yeah, and I would definitely encourage the person asking the question to just kind of maybe even reach out to us offline, and we can talk in more detail about which system is applicable to what sector.
For sure, and everybody's emails are listed here on the slide, so feel free to reach out to us. And then again, do the survey once you close out, and we can get in touch with you if you'd like us to. Anything else before we go?
No, thank you, Lindsay, Roxby, and Sarah, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Yeah, for those of you that follow along, we have another webinar scheduled next month on electric vehicles. So go to our website and stay tuned. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.